Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Law Schoolers. In this episode, we are going to be talking about the use of force when it comes to arrest, how much force can be used, and particularly we'll be talking about the use of deadly force when it comes to attempting to effectuate an arrest. So we've got two cases here. We have Tennessee versus Gardner and Scott versus Harris that outlines the rule of when deadly force may or may not be used when effectuating an arrest. According to the rule, deadly force may not be used unless there is probable cause that the subject is going to be a significant significant threat of death or serious injury to the officer or to others at large. A significant threat, the definition of that is going to arise if in the commission of a violent crime, or if the suspect threatens the officer with a weapon. In this kind of situation, if there is a significant threat and the use of deadly force is going to be in effect, well, then the officers also need to give a reasonable warning to the subject about the use of deadly force if that warning is feasible. Why is this the rule? Well, the courts need to balance the interests of the subject, meaning the person who is committing the crime, and it needs to balance the interests of the state. So what interest does the subject has? Well, I think it's a pretty obvious one. The subject wants to preserve their life. That's their interest when you're going to be using deadly force. What interest does the state have? Well, the officers also have an interest in protecting their life, but they also have an interest in preventing crime. And this interest, the state's interest, is going to increase with the severity of the crime that is being committed by the subject. Thus, the more violent crime it is, it could potentially mean the use of deadly force against that subject. In this case, in Tennessee versus Gardner, the use of deadly force was uncalled for because it appeared that the subject was unarmed. What happened here? The officers approached the home after a 911 call ended up happening, and youth ran through the backyard looking for the fence, tried to leap over the fence, and as doing so, the officer ended up shooting the subject. Now, the officer claimed that he believed that the subject I can't remember if the officer claimed that he believed that the subject was committing a violent crime or not, but was trying to prevent the subject from fleeing. The court is also going to consider historic common law rule and that any force necessary to prevent a felony crime was committed. That was the thing too, is that the officers knew that the subject was committing a felony. It may not have been violent because the person wasn't armed, but it was a felony, and the common law rule allowed any force necessary to prevent a felony. Ultimately, the reasoning for this is that, that reasoning doesn't fit into society today. Guns back in the day were used different at the founding of the Fourth Amendment, and crimes today are generally not going to be punishable by death anymore. Still happens, but not in very many states. The dissent in this case, though, is arguing that this is a new rule, and it's a new rule that creates a protection, and that protection is freedom from flight. The freedom of flight from committing a crime. And this is not a protection that is afforded by the Fourth Amendment. Additionally, it's going to limit the officer's ability to act in the moment. And in the present case, the decision made by the majority is benefited only by hindsight. Even though this is a regrettable incident, we have the benefits of knowing now that the defendant was unarmed, but how could the officer in that moment have determined whether or not the subject was unarmed? This outlines the rule for when deadly force may be applied. There are rules, though, related to excessive force, because excessive force is also to be limited. These rules are often going to be provided by state legislatures and by policies within police departments who are seeking to reform the police officers to reduce any unnecessary force. So that's really our takeaway from Tennessee versus Gardner, is a use of deadly force is going to have to be, one, if it's a commission of a violent crime. So this is going to be like armed robbery, because that's a violent crime, having a weapon and robbing. And then also, if the suspect is going to threaten the officer with a weapon. Ultimately, both these things have one thing in common, and it's going to be that the suspect is armed or threatening the use of a weapon. What's our second case? Scott versus Harris. Our rule here is that the officer's use of force is going to be fine if that force is objectively reasonable. So how do you determine whether or not that force is going to be objectively reasonable? Well, when it comes to, at least in a vehicle, you're going to consider the safety of others on the road. You're going to look at how dangerous the use of force is, and going to be both to the subject or to others around the subject, and whether or not the subject is going to be culpable for the danger that they could potentially be causing to others. Scott versus Harris is not a case of a deadly force. Instead, it's a case. Well, let me tell you what happened in Scott versus Harris. This is an officer conducting a pit stop, a pit maneuver. A pit maneuver, I can't remember exactly what the acronym stands for, but I think the P stands for precision. I can't remember what the I stands for, and T stands for technique. In other words, really what a pit maneuver is when you're on a high-speed chase, it's when the officers bump the bumper of the fleeing subject to cause them to lose control of the vehicle and end the high-speed chase in a very quick manner. Now, in Scott versus Harris, this is the question of, is conducting a pit maneuver an example of deadly force? Because it could potentially lead to the death of the subject who is fleeing. And the majority here in this case says, no, this is not an example of deadly force. If we look at those factors that we talked about earlier, the use of force is going to be reasonable. Otherwise, it's going to incentivize dangerous driving if we just allow people who are in the situation to flee. The dissent, though, is going to argue that the driver in the situation was not threatening other parties at the time in this case. There was minimal traffic at the time. And so this would be a question for the jury rather than the court to determine whether or not this was an example of deadly force. If you do want to actually look at the video for Scott versus Harris, there are videos on YouTube just to give you some key indicators of what you would end up looking for. If you just Google high-speed car chase and then look for one where it's really old, really blurry, and at night. And that's going to be the one that was at issue in Scott versus Harris. It should come up pretty quickly. Or you can also just look at the Scott versus Harris car chase. Okay, we have another case here. This is Buckley versus Haddock. I'm not going to get into the facts of this case because this case was kind of shared with us on a confidential basis anyways. So I don't want to put the information out there publicly either way. But let's just say the officers in this situation was using force that might seem a little excessive, to put it lightly. This was a case of qualified immunity, which we will talk about in a future episode. But our big takeaway from this case is that there is a high deference the police to determine what is reasonable. And what I mean by that is the courts are typically going to defer to the police when it comes to the reasonableness standard. Most of the time, the officers are going to win, even if it is a little intense. And the whole point of this is because we're weighing the interests of ensuring the effectiveness of an arrest is pretty effectual. You want to make sure that an arrest can happen, and that is such a high interest that it can sometimes overpower the interests of the individual as well. So officers typically are going to have high deference from the courts, even if that deference might seem a little extreme at times. And that's going to conclude our discussion on arrests. We talked about the principles of arrest. In another episode, we talked about citations, and now we talked about the use of force when you're conducting an arrest. Specifically, we talked about the use of deadly force and excessive force and what the standards are going to be for both of those. Our next subject that we are going to be covering is a broad category of searches in reoccurring contexts. We're going to start with searches of persons in reoccurring contexts. And I will catch you later when that happens. Have a good one. Bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Law Schoolers. Before I let you go, there are 4 things I want to say. The first thing is if you enjoyed these episodes and if you enjoyed the website, I would invite you to go and join Law Schoolers Pro. And you can do that by going to lawschoolers.com/join. It's a way for you to support us, but there's also a lot of features there that I think you will enjoy. Second thing is that nearly all of our episodes are unedited. The only ones that aren't are pre-law materials, and the reason for that is so you can actually see the legal material in its raw form as I'm learning it as well. The third thing is that the information contained in these episodes are specifically only for educational purposes. They're not to be used as legal advice, and with that, the fourth thing is if it is used as legal advice, we are not liable. That is, Law Schoolers is not liable for any legal outcomes. Thank you again for enjoying the show. Have a good one.